where alongside our partners in Copenhagen, Hamburg and Helsinki, we are aiming to bridge the gap between theory, practice and policy by delivering new techniques, case studies and other activities that demonstrate how circular construction can be implemented at the city scale. So my name is Lucy Rees. I'm a sustainability advisor for the UK Green Building Council, with a specific focus on our work relating to innovation, research, and of course, circular economy. Today, I'm going to be giving you a quick overview of our recently launched circular economy guidance packs, particularly those that provide guidance on how to implement product and material reuse strategies. Then I will invite our colleagues from Expedition Engineering and Resourceful Futures to present some examples of their work in accelerating our transition to a low carbon, resilient and future and resource efficient city. This will be followed by a Q&A. So if you'd like to ask any questions to either me or our guest speakers, please feel free to do so. And we've got a Q&A chat box that will be running throughout the presentation. So we'll keep track of anything you ask and address that at the end. A quick intro to us at UKGBC. We are an industry-led network with a mission to radically improve the sustainability of the built environment. We represent current and future industry leaders who are striving for transformational change and to identify and adopt the most sustainable, viable solutions to today's challenges. And we also engage our members in advocating this progressive message to government and helping to inform and influence policy there. Resource use and circular economy are one of our key impact areas here at UKGBC. A circular economy we define as one in which we keep resources in use for as long as possible, extract the maximum value from them while they're in use, and then recover and regenerate products and materials at the end of their service life. In general, a circular economy can be created and driven through various principles, which vary depending on industry, but broadly follow a fairly similar pattern. So at UKGBC, we've defined what we see these 5 key principles for circular economy in the built environment as maximizing reuse, designing for optimization, which includes a focus on longevity, flexibility, assembly, disassembly, and recovery, standardization of design, products as a service, and minimizing construction impacts and waste, which includes the use of low impact new materials and those with high recycled content, as well as designing out waste itself. So today, what we're going to do is focus on this first principle highlighted, which is the principle of reuse. To give some context about what we're talking about, it is generally reported that about 60% of the UK waste generated from construction, demolition and excavation, which is leading to a huge carbon footprint in producing just building materials alone. And since in Britain we've got sort of over 50,000 buildings demolished every year, we are recovering sort of around 90% of that, but a lot of it is recycled into less valuable products as opposed to being reused. So UKGBC recently launched 2 new implementation packs to guide people looking to incorporate circular economy principles into their projects. These packs followed up on our previous guidance, which was the circular economy guidance for construction clients, focusing particularly on how to apply circular economy principles at the project brief stage. So as I previously mentioned, today, our attention will be on product and material reuse. So we're going to give you an overview specifically on our reuse implementation pack, which is highlighted here. This was created by us with industry input and consulting various stakeholders in a peer review group. The diagram to the bottom here gives a visual representation of the material flow concepts that's presented in our implementation pack, which is formed of these 2 key documents highlighted. Firstly, we created the Circular Economy How-To Guide, which covers the 3 key reuse objectives that are shown here. The first is how to create a product and material recovery inventory to support reuse on an existing project. The second is how to reuse materials and products from another project. And the third is how to send any materials and products that you can't use on site, off-site for reuse elsewhere. And then alongside this, we also wanted to create a guidance for project teams to explain to others how they can make these three objectives happen, which led to the creation of our why and what of reuse slide deck. So this sets out not only why we believe that our reuse objectives are important, but also exactly what our guidance documents cover in a downloadable slide deck to help project teams themselves make the case for incorporating reuse into building design. So focusing on those three reuse objectives that I just outlined, our how-to guide takes project teams working on demolition, deconstruction, refurbishment, or fit-out projects through the processes, roles, and responsibilities allocation to maximise reuse and the reclamation of materials. We give a general understanding of what information is required, who needs to be involved, and at what point in the project programme you should be doing this. And then a final document specifically relating to reuse that I'd like to draw your attention to is our Innovation Insights report. This highlights organisations and innovations currently within the market who are facilitating addressing that challenge that we've been speaking about, i.e. how do we reuse materials and products on our project, and how can we send any products off-site for reuse elsewhere if we can't use them. So examples that we highlight in this document are companies such as Signify, who provide lighting as a service, Cleveland Steel and Tubes, who provide steel reuse, Globe Chain, who are a reuse marketplace, and then Raised Modular Flooring, who provide reuse for raised access flooring. So it's organisations such as these who are actively addressing the challenges that we face relating to material reuse in construction. And it's sort of, this is now the time for the paradigm shift in the way we create our built environment, and we need an industry that can respond positively to this challenge by reusing resources and procuring products as services in this way. So a quick summary here of the many benefits of reuse to business, the environment and society. We believe this is really an opportunity waiting to be seized, and that those who actually take the step change in business as normal now will reap the rewards down the line, particularly in regards to staying ahead of government policy. To download the slides and the guides that we have been talking about today, and generally for more information on our work in relation to circular economy this year, please do visit our website, which is listed here, or feel free to directly contact me. So that concludes a quick introduction to the topic and where UKGBC are working in circular economy this year. And I'm now going to hand over to George Oates, who is Associate Director at Expedition Engineering, to take us through how they have applied some of these principles in their work.
Thank you, Lucy. Great, hopefully this should work. Bear with us, let's see if it just relaunches. Great. Okay, thank you. So today I'm going to talk about a project that I worked on for sort of 4 or 5 years, which was the Duke Street project for Selfridges as a case study in reuse of existing buildings. Expedition is part of the Useful Simple Trust, and we're a social enterprise with a strong environmental purpose. Actually, our sister company, Useful Projects, are heavily involved in promoting circular economy and are talking this week about it. You may know Expedition through projects such as the Olympic Velodrome, headquarters for WWF, but also in the bottom left-hand corner is the transformation of 55 Baker Street, the old M&S headquarters, which was one of the first significant scaled commercial reuse schemes back in 2005. Still one we're very proud of. And as Lee said, today we're talking about maximising reuse, and really I'm focusing heavily on 1A in this 5-step diagram, comes straight from UKGBC guidance around reuse of the existing assets. And throughout these 10 minutes, I'm going to make reference to some of the guidance that's within these documents, explaining its relevance to projects such as Selfridges. So Selfridges, if you aren't aware, is in London on Oxford Street, and it's actually quite a large, it's not just the Oxford Street facing store, it actually takes up a whole city block spanning from Oxford Street all the way back to Wigmore Street pretty much. And it has a long history of circular economy principles through a number of modifications. It started 100 years ago, and there have been a number of changes since. But the client was looking for a complete upgrade and a revamp for going properly into the 21st century. But they were unsure of what they could do with the existing asset at this point. And the master plans that had been done prior to our involvement involved a lot of demolition and rebuild to create new glitzy buildings, whereas we thought that there was something we could do working much more closely with the existing asset. So diving back into UKGBC guidance, there's a section describing benefits that the client can take from using a reuse strategy. And I've highlighted that the phased refurbishment is probably the single most important feature of this project for the client. Their business is around retail, and it's around floor area. So being able to reuse, being able to keep the building largely open while we did the phased construction was a key aspect. And in terms of our work, I've highlighted that the presumption in favour of retaining most, if not all, of the asset, so in this instance the structure, was the key overriding principle that ran through all of our design work. So it's great to see linkages. A moment on the commercial side, we had a client who understood the value of their asset, which is very important, but we were also enabled to have an alternative commercial model because the client was able to directly value the floor area that was able to be maintained. And this enabled us to offset the increased cost of works that can be associated with reuse around temporary works and more complex construction sequencing. So that benefit for us was enabled to be run into the construction budget. So looking at the overall building, we decided the way to kind of really give it a new lift was to find a few key strategic interventions that would enable the whole, the greater than 90% of it to remain occupied unaffected, and then the discrete changes giving a new flavour to the new building. Now I'm only going to talk today about number 3, which is the new ramp that comes up from the loading bay in the middle of the basement that was halfway down Duke Street and broke up the whole eastern facade. And then we're just going to touch on the new building that's gone into the new entrance building that's gone into the eastern facade as well. But you can see a number of kind of strategic interventions undertaken over around 5 years. So the first step was to build a new ramp. So this is a 50-metre long vehicle road bridge that we had to construct within the confines of an existing building. So a new steel trussed structure. And we have on the left was the existing section through the building and across the link road. And then on the right, you can see that we've located a ramp within the existing building, while all of the floors above that ramp are fully occupied. And to the left of where the ramp was constructed, they were selling handbags throughout the works. This slide doesn't come through quite right, but we had limited access to opening up work. So you want to start by understanding what you have and try and survey it and understand it as much as you can. But there's a limit to that because it's still an occupied building. So for us, the important point was finding the balance between getting enough information to develop a robust scheme, but then designing the details in a way that allowed flexibility with how that can actually be applied in process. So that as we went into construction and we understood more details, we could work with those. So just as an example, these were a series of columns that support existing columns for the existing building that support this new ramp that runs through it. And at the outset, we thought there was a reasonably high chance that most of them would need to be strengthened. So we discussed that openly with the client. Then during the works, we undertook the investigation, opened up the columns, measured them, understood them, tested them for their steel makeup, whether they could be welded to or not. And then we were able to refine the details based on that and do our detailed checks. And lo and behold, obviously engineers like this one, we showed that we didn't need to strengthen hardly any of the columns, there were just a few. So having that open dialogue with the client at the start and building in an understanding about the risks and how to manage those risks was an important part of the success of the project. One little feature where the ramp came through, you know, a particular structural challenge, we were knocking out existing columns and they were supporting existing floors. So we had to go through a process of jacking to transfer the loads from the existing columns into the new frame, into the new ramp structure. But the nice thing about this, as shown on the diagram on the left, is that we tried to arrange it in a way that we took the existing buildings loads and put them back on the existing buildings columns and foundations in the same way. So in that way, we were able to avoid kind of major strengthening to the existing structure or lots of new foundations and new columns. That process takes lots of communication and then some exciting works done at night in a controlled environment. And working in existing, trying to do something like this within an existing building was challenging. It had to be done with limited amounts of craneage. But we created the space we needed. And just to the left on this image, the other side of that wall was ongoing live retail. And actually during the demolition, they just turned the volume up on the music so that people didn't hear quite as much as what we were doing. Slide hasn't come through. So just to touch on the new entrance building on Duke Street, which is the architectural piece that really tied the building together. I should say that phase one was done with Genza Architects. Everything I've shown you so far is with Genza Architects, Arup M&E, Stan Hope is development manager. And then on phase two, which was the new entrance building, that was with David Chipperfield as the architect, and the rest of the team were continuous. So this was the old exit to the vehicle ramp, which completely broke up the eastern side of the building. It was pretty messy to look at, and that's how it looks today after we've done our new designed intervention. And this is a cross section kind of running along the building. Each of these different colours, if you can see them, is a different age of construction and a different intervention of different intervention that's happened over the years. So part of working with the existing structure was to do that kind of forensic part of understanding how all of these different aspects link together and rely on each other. And sort of understanding that well enough before you get into the construction of the project, but being aware that you will need to change your approach as you discover new details as you are taking the building apart a little bit. So we decided here to chop off and demolish 2 bays of structure in order to keep the remainder of the rest of the building, kind of creating this new piece of architecture. Which led to some fairly large construction activities and large masonry piers being suspended, and then new small steel columns coming back in. And temporary works, which is shown here in these grey steels, are all the temporary construction stage. So justifying the building in that temporary construction stage is one of the most important aspects that we found in doing this reuse project. So above this red crane, there are 3 stories of live retail that are fully operational as we're digging out the support underneath it. Targeted interventions is again, there's another final key. So this is a new stair core that we decided to run up in the corner of the building with associated strengthening works, but this strategic intervention unlocked the pedestrian flows in and around the buildings into the new office floor space we made. And that is the outcome. So I just wanted to finish as a final slide. This again comes from the UKGBC guidance, which talks about the perceived challenges that clients and design teams may see with reusing of an existing building. And I thought it was very interesting that a number of the points that are highlighted on here were challenges for us, and were challenges that I think that we overcame, such as compliance with current building regs, limited or unknown information on the technical performance of the current asset that we've talked about. But I think particularly things like the appearance of the building is outdated, or the clients prefer new or a more appropriate look. And I think this is exemplified by the approach of strategic new interventions which enable to unlock the the value in the existing asset. So by targeting small areas, we've enabled the great majority of the existing building to be reused and given hopefully another 100 years of life. Thank you very much. Very short, very short presentation. Right, I shall hand over back to Lucy to give to Alan. Thank you.
Okay, good morning everybody. I'll just get the slide deck up just now. My name is Alan Sandons and I work for Resource Futures, and I'm going to talk to you this morning about the Expo 2020 Dubai UK Pavilion project that we were involved in, and specifically looking at the end of life options for the cross laminated timber, or the CLT. Which make up the majority of the platform of the pavilion. Now, I'm not sure how familiar people are with the UK Pavilion, but as you can see, it's quite an iconic design, which is what the Department of International Trade was going for and asked from the design team. The theme of the UK's pavilion is innovating for a shared future. And they wanted to highlight specific British expertise in sectors such as artificial intelligence and space, but also recognising that climate change had to feature quite importantly, and therefore they were determined to find a sustainable and ethical option for the pavilion at its end of life. The actual Expo site in Dubai came with a lot of requirements, initially being that they want the site back. So the obvious, could you just leave the building in place option wasn't on the table, unfortunately, for the 190 countries who are participating in it. Now, obviously, it was due to be launching in 2020, but because of COVID, it's been pushed back to October 2021, and it will be open for 6 months before they then deconstruct it. The project as a whole, I think, was the first time that really that DIT had formally approached the end of life solution for the building and put out a piece of work to contract like they did. I think it's fair to say in the past that they've struck it lucky in terms of they've built these phenomenal pavilions, and someone has come along and said, that's brilliant, I've got a great use for it in such and such a location, can we come to an agreement and move it to London or move it to wherever? And they've had a good outcome from a sustainability point of view. But with this particular design, this particular pavilion, it's the first time that DIT commissioned someone to help them produce a framework, and that was really our remit on the project. So our kind of journey in the project, it was a small piece of work. So our initial desktop research was really looking at past pavilions to see what had been done from a reusability point of view or circularity, but also has anyone else used CLT before and previous expos, and what have they done with it? So once we had established that and we'd seen the good, the bad and the ugly, I think it's fair to say, we helped DIT establish a scoring criteria around what was of use to them, what was their key driving principles, because on a project like this, circularity is one of many competing principles. So what we wanted the framework to do was to help them evaluate options against that scoring criteria. Then we helped them generate some concepts for consideration, did a bit of further in-depth research, and shortlisted, eliminated some of the options based on feasibility at that particular stage in the project, and then produced this is our recommendations at this stage to go forward and investigate further, because obviously, as I mentioned, it's a small piece of work. We didn't go all the way down the rabbit hole as such. So just to give you an idea, the main focus was on the CLT part of the building, not the concrete wedge holding it up as such, because that made up the majority of the material. But what we found is that there has been a lot of focus on CLT to encourage its use and promote it further in the sector, but there has been very little research or understanding that's went into how to deal with this material at its end of life. How recyclable is it? How reusable is it? Is there any standards that can be used to help to level the playing field for its reuse? So there's been a number of articles that have kind of summed up, and the quote on the screen just now kind of really captured that observation quite well when we started looking into it. Now, the design team obviously they weren't tasked with considering alternative materials or different types of construction. They were given what they were given as such. And their brief was to design a building that was made of sustainable materials and was deconstructible. And that's all the brief that they were given. So that's a crucial thing to bear in mind. So in terms of the scoring criteria, we used a Pugh matrix to work with some of the key players in the team to understand which was the priority for them in terms of these multiple different considerations. And the results came out, a little bit not surprisingly, that reputational risk and positive messaging was the kind of key drivers for this project. They wanted a legacy story, and that was very important to them. And therefore, they wanted a high level of transparency as to where this material would end up. And they didn't want it ending up somewhere that it shouldn't, shall we say. Cost obviously was a very big driver from a capital cost point of view, because DIT didn't have a huge budget. Once the building was deconstructed, there was no more budget to then move it a great distance or do anything with it. So they were very much looking for whoever would take the building and the material to then do something with it. So the cost implications were quite important to them. And then the circularity of the concept, they did want to try and look to reuse first in terms of full structural reuse, then into reuse of components, then into the recycling and working your way down the hierarchy. Just simply recycling it would have complied with the Expo requirements, but it was never DIT's aim. So that was important to consider. Obviously, the logistical practicality of it's very well me throwing out a concept and then they go, well, yeah, but Alan, that's just not possible. So that had to be in there. And then the carbon legacy, I think they would have probably admitted that carbon wasn't the driving factor for them. If it had meant transporting it all the way back to the UK to show a really good story, that would have probably scored higher than don't move it very far and save the carbon. But it was a consideration, it was in there. And then the operational cost, that scored 0 because of the fact that they didn't have a budget to maintain or do anything post deconstruction, whereas if they had some money in that part of the pot, that I would imagine that would have went up much higher in the rankings as well. So they asked us to consider 3 potential locations for all of our concepts. So obviously Dubai, where it was, but also 2 other countries, Malawi and Ethiopia, were considered suitable countries to consider options for. And we came up with 11 concepts, working our way down the waste hierarchy list, and compared each of them against the 3 country scenarios. And obviously there were various location specific factors that would be taken into place in terms of the climates were very different, but also material specific in terms of do the trades exist in those countries to do what we're proposing to do. So it was important to consider those location specific factors as well as the different concept ideas. And what we found going through the concept ideas is that this is the kind of recommendation panel results that came out, because we had to reject the straightforward structural reuse because there was no existing standard for the CLT use, and therefore the testing program that would have been required from a structural point of view to give the confidence that this material was structurally sound would have been cost prohibitive. For each variant would have had to be considered for each panel, beam, etc. So we were told that the cost of 1 variant would have been about £13,000. So I think that's one that we would have all loved to see the building move exactly as it is, but because of the structural concerns and because it needed a wedge of concrete of a building to hold it up, which obviously had a capital cost as well. It wasn't ever practical. It was never designed in a way to just lift it and move it, perhaps in the way that other previous pavilion projects had been. So I think that's one of the crucial learnings from the designer side of things is, yes, make it deconstructible, but you have to go further than that in the brief, but also in the remit. You have to think about its next intended use, particularly for a temporary structure like this that is only intended to be up for a very short space of time. So obviously DIT are now investigating each of these options and the contacts and the leads that we identified for them to pursue and discuss. Obviously there's academia in Dubai that are quite keen to take the material. But obviously when you're not thinking about an entire structure reuse and you start to go down to component level, what you find is that's an awful lot of material to deal with. So our key reflections, as I said, were to task the designers to go beyond deconstructibility, but to think about reusability and how to incentivize that. So in the image in the top left there is the Multiply project, which is made of CLT, and it's a reconfigurable structure. Now, some might say it's a very boring design in comparison to what the Pavilion structure is, but I think what that shows that designers approaching the task in different ways. One was given make an iconic building that is made of sustainable materials and deconstructible brief. Another one was given we want a reconfigurable, reusable building made of sustainable materials as well, hence the difference in the design. So the other side that we learned was obviously the pursuit of a reuse story was very much viewed as the best PR story. If that building could have been reused as a temporary accommodation, as a school, those were the stories that the client really wanted and would have really liked to pursue. But when you don't have that full structural reuse story and you're then having to break it into components, then it's actually quite a lot of hard work, because that's 350 tons of timber that you need to find a home for. And what you find is it's unlikely to be then one person who would want that. So you've got a lot, chances are those 6 or 7 options that kind of came through, I would expect the material to probably end up being spread across all of them to different degrees, probably to varying, depends on the demand for it. So that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour to the project and what we were asked to do on the programme. And I think we're quite proud that we've left them a legacy and a framework that they can follow for future expos. And I'd be interested to see the next design brief that goes out from them and how this has helped shape their remit going forward. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you everyone for your great and very insightful presentations. I'd like to remind our attendees that they can send through questions in the Q&A chat, either directed to specific panelists or general ones for everyone to answer. But I can start off here with the focus. I guess what we're thinking about is how can we accelerate reuse in our own cities and make this a common sort of aspect we consider in our practice in the built environment industry. Have any of you considered, kind of from a city planning or a national government perspective, whether requiring perhaps a certain percentage of reused or recycled materials, or even requiring to look at reusing buildings first before putting up a new one, is something that we should see coming from government? Or do you see any potential immediate harms coming from this?
I think if I go first then, I think that would be personally I think that would be a very positive step. We've seen already, even within our own practice, as we've tried to hold ourselves to account on kind of using some of the principles of the circular economy principles around reuse, not so much on kind of whole scale justification of an existing structure, because we sort of by our nature would be doing that anyway, but an example being that there's an existing hall that has to be demolished because it can't fulfill the function it needs to anymore, and we've got to replace it. But actually we went through a review even within the practice and found that actually we could go about, touching on Alan's points, we could go about trying to find a home for the existing hall structure in its entirety. And actually, so we've spent a bit of time now working with the client organisation to try and put us in touch with other buyers who may have need of a space like that. So I think that, yeah, if that was pushed in by government and it forced us to do, it forced clients to take stock of the existing buildings they've got to understand what potential there is there for reuse. And then it challenged designers to actually show that they had considered that seriously before moving on to a solution of it's just going to be demolished, it's going to be removed. And I think that'd be a really important step. My final point on that is that I think clients often don't, clients don't realise perhaps what the value of the asset they already have is, how much capacity is sat within it, how much longevity can be extended into the existing structure of small kind of interventions. You know, if there's surface degradation on something, you can address that and then give the building or the structure, part of the structure, another 50 years, another 60 years. And I think clients, we assume that clients have an understanding of their existing buildings, but actually I think that they need to rely perhaps more on the technical industry to support them in that.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think I'm quite jealous of what's happening in London, to be perfectly honest, both from the kind of circular economy planning statement level and also your plethora of engaged clients. I don't think that's retrospective across the country. So we need more encouragement for clients to consider this, and whether that's you have to consider it. I think that will drive the mainstream. And I think what we've seen is there's been so many material exchanges and things like that set up in the past, and then they disappear and they fail because they never get the consistent volume of throughput. It's always on a one-off project that suddenly now that exemplar project, that demo project, then has the chance to look for something, and then they find it hard, and then they don't do it again. I think George's presentation is proof that if you give the construction industry time and the remit and the brief to do it, they'll find the solution. But what they need to be told to do it is consistently. And then that way we're going to see it consistently on all projects, and that will then strengthen all of our interventions on good practice and exchanges and increased reuse.
Thank you both. It's great. I think another problem we see, or challenge we see come up a lot in industry, especially when we're thinking of reusing built assets, is concerns about the safety and quality of what's already there, and concerns about reusing that in the future. So can you maybe talk a bit more about testing, reliability, and insurance from a reuse perspective, either when looking at using an old building, or from Alan's perspective, how can you incorporate that into the building that you're creating to make sure it can be reused in the future?
I think George might be better.
George, you want to go first? I think you raised a really good question. Really good question there, particularly around the insurance point, which is a really knotty problem, which has actually been around for quite a long time, because people have tried to and have successfully reused foundations for quite a long time, and that's one of the hardest areas to talk about, kind of testing and proof of how the existing. So you have a pile that's already in the ground. It was constructed 50 years ago. There's no reason to expect why it won't give at least another 50 years beyond. But understanding who takes the risk on that, and therefore the insurance that comes associated with it is a challenge. It's a real challenge. To be honest, it works best when there's a pragmatic, well, first of all, a pragmatic client, but a kind of a pragmatic team approach. So it's always going to be, there is going to be risk that remains, but as long as that risk is of a level that feels appropriate compared to the value of the asset, and that can be sensibly held by the client, then so Selfridges is an easy example. They are a client owner. They own the building, they understand the value of that building, and therefore they are probably more willing than others maybe to hold on to a risk of how that structure is going to perform. But at the same time, you, as a professional, then you balance that with as much testing as you think is appropriate to give you the right level of confidence that what's there is going to be okay. So there is no reason why a steel column, which is 100 years old, if it shows no sign of degradation, why it won't last another 100 years. It goes wrong with steel is it corrodes, but as long as there is no corrosion there, and you might back that up by taking a small coupon and sending it to a laboratory to do a material test on it, check it has the material strength you think it has, check there are no underlying issues with it at a microscopic level that you weren't aware of. Design your details to deal with whatever particular historic thing comes out of that steelwork, whether the welding may be a bit brittle, so you have to change your welding procedure. So there are things that you adjust based on what's there, but it's doing enough testing to give you the confidence, make the testing broad enough to cover enough of the aspects, but then understanding there will always be some residual risk, and fundamentally the client is the best person to own that risk because it's their asset. But it's taking them on that journey is probably this hackneyed phrase, but it is taking them on that journey is the kind of I think the most important part of that.
I think it's also important when you can get the original manufacturer willing to be involved in the process, and they ultimately know their products best. So I know there's a number of examples on UKGBC guidance documents and Cleveland tubes and things like that. They're willing to be part of the solution. They're willing to be part of the testing part of the solution as well. So I think when you can get those examples of products that are the manufacturer recognises their inherent residual value, that strengthens the case for reuse. It's very easy just to say, oh, reuse is hard across the board. But I think there are easier wins and quicker wins, and that there are parts of reuse that are hard to do. But there will be those easier ones, and I think if you can go in and find and be encouraged to find the easier ones, then that'll just make it build momentum time and time again.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. I think we're at the end of our time already, but thank you for your insightful answers, for joining us today. We have been recording, so this will be available for anyone who's watching to watch again or circulate with your friends and colleagues if you're interested in the topic. And be sure to check out the rest of the Built Environment Day events today. There's one more session and then a hackathon later in the afternoon. I'm sure we'd like to see you there. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much. Thank you, Alan, for joining that. Very well done. Very interesting presentation. I think it was a good contrast to, yeah,
thanks for having us, Alexandra. I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, great. Are you coming to any of the other sessions today?
Yeah, I'm on one at 11 and then one at 2, I think.
Great. Okay. All right. Thanks.
Thank you, Ellen, and thank you, Alexandra, as well.
Thanks, Matilda, for everything.
Have any in the Q&A box, but I think that worked quite well with you reading them out. Kind of felt like a conversation rather than a formal Q&A. So yeah, that worked well.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Cool.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.